The bread is at the back of the store. It has always been at the back of the store. You have walked past the towers of canned goods, past the pyramids of oranges stacked with geometric patience, past the long cold corridor of the dairy case with its fog of refrigerated air, and now you have arrived, slightly breathless, at the bread. This is not an accident. None of it is an accident. The year is 1954. The store is called a supermarket, a word so new it still sounds futuristic, like something from a radio serial. It is a Saturday morning in a Midwestern city, and the parking lot outside holds 37 automobiles, which is a kind of miracle in itself. The plate glass windows run floor to ceiling. Inside, the fluorescent tubes hum at a frequency just below the threshold of hearing, a low electric purr that settles into the back of the skull and stays there. You came in for bread and butter. You will leave with 14 items. Somewhere across the country, in a modest office in New York, a man named Ernest Dichter is reviewing a report. He has spent the last 3 months studying you. Not you specifically, though it might as well be. He has been studying women who shop, which in 1954 means nearly every married woman in America. He has been studying what they say they want, and more importantly, what they actually want, and more importantly still, the gap between the two. He has filled 200 pages with his findings. The supermarket industry has paid him very well for this information. Dichter calls it motivation research. The stores call it floor planning. You call it going to the grocery store. This is the story of how the 1950s supermarket was built around you, for you, and quietly, systematically, against you. It is the story of psychologists who studied the way women moved through stores, the way their hands reached for things, the way their eyes paused on certain colors, the way guilt and desire operated in the vegetable aisle. It is the story of a retail revolution dressed up as convenience. And it is, in its own strange way, a love story of sorts, though the affection was entirely one-sided. Settle in. The lights are low. The store is quiet. We are going to take our time. You are standing in a supermarket in 1954, and you are wearing good shoes. Not your best shoes, but better than house shoes, because you have learned that the store is a kind of public stage, and you dress for it accordingly. Your hair is set. Your coat is buttoned. You have your list folded in your pocketbook, written in the careful handwriting you use for things that matter. The store is enormous by the standards of what came before. There were grocery stores before this, of course, corner markets and butcher shops and the A&P with its narrow aisles and its smell of sawdust and salt. But those stores were designed around the shopkeeper, around the man behind the counter who knew your name and your mother's name and would reach behind him for what you needed. This store is designed around you. Or so you are told. The cart is one of the first things you notice. It is a wire basket on wheels, and it is larger than it needs to be. A man named Sylvan Goldman invented the shopping cart in 1937, but it took years for women to accept them, because at first the carts felt indecorous, too large, too obvious in their implication that you might want more than you came in for. Goldman had to hire actors to push the carts around his store before real customers would use them. Now, in 1954, the cart is simply part of the choreography. You take one without thinking. You rest your pocketbook in the child's seat at the top. You push. The store arranges itself around the arc of your movement. This is not natural. Nothing about a supermarket is natural, though it has been designed with extraordinary care to feel that way. The produce is near the entrance, bright and fresh and slightly damp, smelling of earth and cold water. The logic, if there is a logic, is that freshness is welcoming, that the scent of real food draws you forward, that beginning among tomatoes and celery puts you in a generous mood before you have spent a single cent. This is not an accident. Someone studied it. A man named Victor Gruen is often called the father of the shopping mall, and while his greatest work is still to come, his influence on retail space in the early 1950s is already being felt. Gruen understood that shopping was emotional before it was practical, that the arrangement of goods in space could produce feelings, and that feelings loosened the grip on the pocketbook. He designed stores to disorient shoppers gently, to make them slow down and look around, to manufacture a kind of pleasant confusion that resulted in unplanned purchases. He called it the Gruen transfer, the moment when a shopper shifts from purposeful movement to a kind of aimless browsing, when the list in the pocket loses its power and the eyes begin to roam. You are experiencing the Gruen transfer right now, though you do not know its name. You have paused in front of a display of glass jars. The glass is very clean and the light catches it nicely, and for a moment you simply stand there, not quite thinking, not quite not thinking, your hand on the handle of your cart, your eyes moving from label to label. You were not going to buy jam today. You came in for bread and butter. The cart, you notice, has become slightly heavier than it was. If you enjoy listening to sleepy stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Victor Gruen arrived in America in 1938 with $40 and an architectural degree from Vienna, and within 20 years he had reshaped the way Americans spent money. He was a compact, energetic man with a theatrical streak and a genuine love of public space, qualities that made him both a visionary designer and, eventually, a man deeply troubled by what he had helped create. But that reckoning was still years away. In the early 1950s, Gruen was building. He had come from a city that knew how to make shopping beautiful. Vienna's Ringstrasse arcades, its enclosed passages of shops with their glass ceilings and marble floors, their sense of weather kept at bay while commerce continued in warmth and light, this was the model Gruen carried inside him. In America, he saw parking lots and strip malls and stores that faced the road with their backs to each other, and he thought, we can do better. We can make a place where people want to stay. The supermarket was a slightly different problem than the shopping mall, but the underlying principle was the same. You had to get people inside, and then you had to slow them down. Movement through a retail space was the enemy of revenue. A customer who moved efficiently from entrance to exit, collecting only what she needed, was a customer who left money behind. The goal was not to trap her, exactly. The goal was to make the space so interesting, so full of unexpected pleasures, that she chose to linger. Gruen studied how women moved through stores. He noticed that shoppers tended to travel counterclockwise, bearing right when they entered, then proceeding along the perimeter before turning into the interior aisles. This was not universal, but it was common enough to be useful. Stores began to be designed around this tendency, placing high-value items along the natural path of travel, ensuring that the most profitable sections were encountered first, when the cart was still empty and the mood was still fresh. He noticed that shoppers who were slightly confused bought more than shoppers who were certain of where they were going. This seems counterintuitive, but it makes a kind of deep sense. Certainty is efficient. Uncertainty is exploratory. A shopper who is not quite sure where the soup is will see things along the way to finding it. She will notice a display of crackers she had not been thinking about. She will pause at a sample table. She will add things to the cart not from need but from opportunity, because the opportunity presented itself in the moment of mild, pleasant lostness. This is why supermarkets move things around. Not always, and not arbitrarily, but periodically, enough to disrupt the automatic routes that experienced shoppers develop. A woman who has shopped in the same store for 3 years has learned where everything is, and she moves through it efficiently, like water finding its level. The moment the store rearranges the cereal aisle, she is new again. She is looking. And when she is looking, she is buying. Gruen did not invent all of this, and he would not have claimed to. What he brought was a coherent philosophy, that retail space should be designed with the same care and intention that went into any work of architecture, that the path a shopper walked through a store was a kind of narrative, and that a well-designed narrative kept you reading. Or in this case, reaching. The stores that adopted his principles began to look a certain way. Wide, high-ceilinged, with good lighting that was cool and even across the whole floor. Ends of aisles that opened into small vistas, giving the eye somewhere to land. A sense of abundance everywhere, goods stacked and piled and arranged in ways that suggested plenty, that the world was full and the shelves would never empty. Even the ceilings were considered. Too low and the store felt cramped, hurried, uncomfortable. Too high and it felt cold and institutional. There was a height that felt right, a height that said, "You can take your time here. You are welcome." By 1954, these principles were being applied in supermarkets across the country, refined by experience and by the new science of consumer psychology that was beginning to produce its own findings. The stores were becoming laboratories, though no one called them that to the women who shopped in them. To those women, they were simply the grocery store. The place you went on Tuesday and Saturday. The place you went with your list. Gruen himself would eventually become troubled by what the mall had become, by the way his ideas about public space had been stripped of their civic dimension and turned into pure extraction. He would spend his later years arguing against the car-dependent suburban sprawl his own work had helped enable. He called it his Frankenstein, the mall. He said he refused to be called its father. But that was later, and in a different mood. In 1954, he was still building, still convinced that beauty and commerce could live together in the same room. Outside the window of the supermarket, a woman is lifting groceries from the trunk of a car. She has 2 bags, and she shifts them in her arms to get the back door, and she walks up the front path in her good shoes. Inside, the refrigerator hums. The bread is already sliced. Tomorrow she will go back for the things she forgot, or the things she did not know she needed, and the automatic doors will part for her like a curtain, and she will take a cart, and she will begin again. The store will be waiting. It is always waiting. It was designed to wait. Somewhere in the building, in the arithmetic of the week's spending, is a sum that is slightly larger than it would have been in a different kind of store. This difference is not dramatic. It is not a crisis. It is the cost of a jar of jam, or a bag of cookies, or a box of crackers that looked good near the cheese. It is the cost of a world that was arranged, with great care and intelligence, to encourage it. Ernest Dichter was a Viennese psychologist who had studied under some of Freud's closest associates, and he brought to the American advertising and retail industry something that it had not known it needed, the conviction that consumers did not understand their own desires. This was not an insult, in his telling. It was simply a fact about the architecture of the mind. People thought they bought things for one reason, when in reality they bought them for another. His job was to find the other reason. He arrived in New York in 1938, the same year as Gruen, and by the mid-1940s he had established what he called the Institute for Motivational Research in Croton-on-Hudson, a handsome stone house above the Hudson River that he filled with researchers and interview rooms and an earnest belief that if you talked to enough housewives, you could learn something true about the human heart. The housewife was his primary subject. This was not condescension, or not exactly. It was strategy. In 1950s America, women made the vast majority of household purchasing decisions. They controlled the grocery budget, the clothing budget, the household goods budget. They were, in the language of the industry, the primary consumer. And yet almost no one in the business world had sat down and asked them, carefully and without agenda, what they actually wanted. Dichter was going to ask. His methods were unusual for the time. He did not simply send out surveys, which he considered nearly useless, because surveys asked people to report their conscious motivations, which were almost never the real ones. Instead, he conducted long, open-ended interviews in which he asked women to describe their shopping experiences in as much detail as possible, encouraging them to free associate, to talk about feelings and textures and smells, to describe the experience of entering a store the way one might describe a dream. What he found was both obvious and surprising. Women, he concluded, did not shop simply for goods. They shopped for something harder to name. They shopped for a sense of agency in a domestic world that offered relatively few arenas for personal expression. They shopped because the supermarket was one of the few places where a woman in 1954 moved through the world as an independent decision-maker, making dozens of small choices, each one a small exercise of taste and judgment. The cart, the list, the careful consideration of one brand over another, these were not trivial acts. They were, in a small but genuine way, expressions of self. Dichter also found that women felt guilty about pleasure. This was not new information, exactly, but he was specific about how this guilt operated in the grocery store. A woman who bought a cake mix, he found, often felt vaguely uncomfortable about it, as if the convenience implied a failure of effort, a shortcoming in her role as the family's caretaker. The fix, he recommended to the manufacturers, was simple: require the woman to add an egg. Not because the egg was necessary for the recipe, but because the act of adding it gave her a sense of participation, of contribution, that transformed the mix from a shortcut into a collaboration. The egg was not about flavor. The egg was about absolution. This finding made him famous in certain circles. It became one of the most cited examples in the history of consumer psychology, and it illustrated his central claim, that the emotional logic of purchasing was often completely invisible to the purchaser, operating below the level of conscious thought, shaped by feelings about self-worth and femininity and the moral weight of domestic labor that no one ever talked about directly. He studied the supermarket the way a naturalist might study a habitat. He mapped the way women moved through aisles, noting where they slowed and where they speeded up, where their hands moved toward the shelves and where they held back. He paid attention to lighting, to color, to the sound of the refrigeration units, to the music that some stores were beginning to pipe in through ceiling speakers. All of it, he argued, was affecting the shopper's mood, her pace, her willingness to reach for something she had not planned to buy. He found that certain colors stopped women more reliably than others. Red and yellow were powerful, warm colors that read as signals of energy and value, that made the eye pause without the shopper quite knowing why. He found that packaging with faces, babies, women, even the idealized farm wives that appeared on butter boxes, created a sense of relationship between the shopper and the product, a subtle feeling that someone trustworthy stood behind what she was about to buy. He found that products placed at eye level sold significantly better than products placed above or below, and that the industry term for this position, prime real estate, was exactly right. The eye was the first market. The grocery manufacturers and the supermarket chains listened carefully. They hired their own researchers. They formed trade associations that pooled findings. The science of the grocery store floor was becoming, quietly, an applied discipline, drawing on psychology and anthropology and the emerging field of industrial design, all in service of the same goal, the moment of reaching, the hand extended toward the shelf, the product dropped into the cart. Dichter was not troubled by any of this. He believed, genuinely, that motivation research was a kind of liberation, that understanding what people truly wanted allowed industry to give it to them more efficiently. He did not see manipulation, he saw service. He thought of himself as a translator, converting the inarticulate desires of consumers into clear signals that manufacturers could respond to. If women wanted to feel capable and trusted and expressive when they shopped, then products should be designed to support those feelings. This was not exploitation. This was empathy at scale. He would spend the rest of his career in this work, writing books, consulting for corporations, appearing on television, always with the same message: people are more interesting than you think, and their desires are more complex, and if you sit with a woman in a well-lit room and ask her how it felt to choose between two brands of soap, she will tell you something true about what it means to be alive in mid-century America. Whether the supermarket was the right place to look for that truth is a different question. But it was the place that was looking. The bread is at the back of the store because bread is what you came for. This is the governing logic of supermarket floor design, and once you understand it, you cannot walk through a grocery store without seeing it everywhere, without feeling the gentle invisible hand of it guiding you past things you did not need toward things you did not know you wanted. It is called a destination item, in the language of the industry. Bread, milk, eggs, butter, the things that anchor a week's cooking, the things that bring you in when the pantry runs low. Every supermarket stocks them, and every supermarket places them with care, not at the front where you might grab them quickly and leave, but deep in the store, at the back or the far corner or the end of the longest aisle, so that reaching them requires a journey. The journey is the point. A woman walking to the back of the store in 1954 passes, on average, between 12 and 16 linear feet of goods on either side of her for every aisle she traverses. If the store is laid out in a grid, and most 1950s supermarkets are, she will pass several complete aisles before she reaches what she came for. The goods in those aisles have been arranged with considerable thought. This is the perimeter strategy, high-frequency items at the edges, drawing traffic past the interior, which holds the higher-margin goods, the things she might not have thought to buy, the impulse purchases that represent, in aggregate, the difference between a profitable store and an ordinary one. The produce section near the entrance is not just welcoming. It is priming. Psychologists studying the grocery store would eventually develop a concept called the shopping basket theory, which held that early purchases in a shopping trip set the emotional tone for everything that follows. A woman who fills the first quarter of her cart with vegetables and fruit feels virtuous, and virtue, it turns out, is expensive. A shopper who feels she has already been responsible is more likely to add something indulgent later, as a reward, as a balance to the discipline she has already demonstrated. The apple and the cookie are in conversation with each other, across the whole length of the store. The end caps, the displays at the end of each aisle, are another piece of the architecture. They are prime real estate in the most literal sense, commanding rents from manufacturers who want their products placed there, because end caps are visible from the main thoroughfare, they catch the eye as the shopper turns, they create a sense of special promotion even when the items on them are not specially priced. A product on an end cap sells 3 to 4 times as well as the same product mid-aisle. The positioning alone does the work. The eye-level rule, which Dichter and his contemporaries documented so carefully, means that the most valuable shelf position in any given section is the one at approximately 54 to 60 inches from the floor, the height at which the average adult woman's gaze rests when she is moving at a browsing pace. The products that appear there are not there by chance. They are there because their manufacturers have paid for the privilege, or because the store's own analysis has placed the items most likely to generate impulse purchases exactly where the eye will find them without being asked to look. Below eye level, toward the floor, you find the heavier items, the large formats, the store brands, the things a careful shopper on a budget seeks out but a casual shopper may overlook. Above eye level, you find items of lower value, things that sit up there like afterthoughts, waiting for the shopper who is thorough enough to look. The middle is where the competition lives. The checkout lane is its own entire world. In 1954, the checkout lane is lined with small items, gum, candy, magazines, cigarettes, small toys for children who have accompanied their mothers and who have been patient, or who have not. These items are not placed here because they needed to go somewhere. They are placed here because the checkout line is captive time. You are standing still. There is nothing else to do. The child at your side has been good for 40 minutes or not especially good and deserves something or needs to be quieted. The pack of gum costs a nickel. The small decision happens without much thought, and the nickel goes into the register. Supermarkets studied the checkout lane with particular care. They found that shoppers who waited longer in line spent more on impulse items at the checkout, not because waiting made them spend but because longer exposure to the candy display increased the likelihood of a purchase. The solution, from a retailer's perspective, was not to make the line shorter. The solution was to make the candy more interesting. There were also the seasonal displays, which appeared and disappeared with the rhythm of the calendar. Near Christmas, displays of baking supplies and gift tins and imported cookies. Near Easter, pastel foil and chocolate eggs. Near 4th of July, outdoor cooking supplies and paper plates, and the particular red, white, and blue geometry of patriotic packaging. These displays worked on a different level than the permanent shelving. They worked on nostalgia and anticipation, on the feeling that a season required its props, that Thanksgiving was not quite itself without a certain brand of stuffing, that Christmas morning depended on a certain kind of cookie tin. The displays also created a sense of abundance that was slightly false, or at least slightly manufactured. The supermarket was always arranged to look full, even when it was not. Items near the back of the shelf were pulled to the front in a practice called facing, so that the shelves always appeared dense with product. Empty space on a grocery shelf read as failure, as shortage, as a store that could not take care of you. Fullness read as plenty, as competence, as a world that was in good working order. The store was always performing abundance, even when the warehouse was running low. This was the architecture that surrounded you on a Tuesday morning in 1954, while you held your list in your pocketbook and moved the cart forward with one hand. The list was your intention. The store was everything else, the feeling of moving through a well-lit, warm, well-stocked world where every turn produced something worth seeing, where the decision to reach was made so easy that you reached without deciding. The list might have 14 items. The cart might hold 23. The difference between those two numbers was not negligence or weakness. It was design. The smell comes first. Before the fluorescent lights resolve into shapes, before the eye has caught the towers of canned goods or the bright geometry of the produce section, the nose has already begun to form an opinion. Supermarkets in the 1950s smelled of many things: fresh-cut flowers near the entrance in the better stores, the cool green dampness of the vegetable mist, the warm sugary smell that drifted from the bakery section, bread that had come from somewhere and arrived in its wax paper sleeve smelling of nothing much, but on good days near the in-store ovens, something that was almost the memory of bread. Ernest Dichter was interested in smell long before the rest of the industry caught up with him. He understood that smell was the most direct of the senses, the one that bypassed the deliberating mind and went straight to something older. The smell of something baking was not just pleasant, it was a map to a particular kind of feeling, the feeling of being somewhere warm and taken care of. If the grocery store could smell like your mother's kitchen on a Saturday afternoon, you would feel, somewhere below the level of thought, that you were in the right place, that this was a place that wanted good things for you. Bakeries and supermarkets were not accidental. They appeared in American grocery stores with increasing frequency through the 1950s, and while the bread they produced was often ordinary, the smell it produced was extraordinary, drifting out from the back of the store in slow warm waves that reached all the way to the produce section. Some stores without in-store bakeries would pipe in the smell artificially, through ventilation systems that released a manufactured bread scent at intervals throughout the day. The bread smell was a set piece, as carefully placed as the end cap display. Music was another tool, and a subtler one. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, as sound systems became affordable for commercial use, supermarkets began playing music through ceiling speakers. The music was always instrumental, always at a volume just above threshold, the kind of music you noticed without quite listening to it. It was called background music, and a company named Muzak was becoming famous for producing it. Muzak had its own science. The company had conducted studies showing that music played at different tempos affected the pace of movement through a commercial space. Slower music made shoppers move more slowly. Shoppers who moved more slowly spent more time in the store. Shoppers who spent more time in the store spent more money. The relationship was not perfectly linear, but it was real enough to act on. Supermarkets that played slow, warm music in the early afternoon, when the store was busy with housewives completing their weekly shop, were making a small but measurable investment in their bottom line. The refrigeration units along the back and side walls of the store produced their own sound, a steady mechanical hum, punctuated by the click and hiss of compressors cycling on and off. This sound was functional, unavoidable. But it also produced something unexpected. The hum was constant enough to become a kind of background presence, a sonic wallpaper that disappeared from conscious attention but remained as a low-level signal of the store's busyness, its industry, its ongoing effort to keep things cold and fresh on your behalf. Temperature itself was part of the design. The produce section was kept cool and slightly damp, which made the vegetables look better and feel better in the hand, but also produced a sensation of freshness, of something recently arrived from a garden. Moving from the produce section into the warmer interior aisles felt like moving from outdoors to indoors, a shift that was subtly invigorating. The freezer aisle was cold enough to make you pause, to slow your browsing, to make the bright-colored boxes of frozen food feel urgent, something to be decided upon quickly and dropped into the cart before the cold reached your fingers. Light was the most complex of the sensory tools. The standard fluorescent tube produced a cool, even, slightly bluish light that flattered certain products, the white packaging of dairy goods, the metallic surfaces of canned goods, anything that read as clean and modern. But it was not flattering to meat, which needed warmth to look appealing. Meat counters used a warmer light, slightly orange-tinted, that made the red of beef and the pink of pork look vivid and fresh rather than dull. A piece of beef under fluorescent light and the same piece under warm light looked like different products. The light was doing the persuasion. Color and packaging responded to the same principles. The supermarket's visual landscape was a negotiated riot of color, each brand trying to catch the eye in the half-second that a shopper's gaze passed across the shelf. Red communicated urgency and value. Yellow communicated warmth and appetite. Blue communicated cleanliness and reliability, which is why it dominated laundry products and cleaning supplies and the packaging of dairy items. Green meant natural, fresh, something from the earth. These were not universal rules, but they were tendencies strong enough to act on, and the packaging designers of the 1950s acted on them with enthusiasm. Dichter had found, in his interviews, that women often described their shopping experience in terms of how the store made them feel rather than what the store contained. Women said things like the store feels friendly, or that store always feels cold and I never buy as much there. The store feels right was the phrase he heard repeatedly, in different forms, from women who had no way to articulate what right meant, only that they knew it when they were inside it. Dichter knew what right meant. It meant that the sensory environment had been calibrated to produce exactly the feeling the store intended you to have: welcome, comfortable, generous, safe. Safe is perhaps the most important of these words. A store that felt safe was a store where you let your guard down. Where you did not clutch your pocketbook, did not calculate too carefully, did not refuse yourself small pleasures on the grounds of thrift. A store that felt safe was a store where you reached. The 1950s housewife was, by almost every social measure, a careful manager. She balanced the household budget against her husband's salary. She clipped coupons and compared prices and noticed when something had gone up a cent since last week. She was not credulous or easily fooled. She was a professional, in her way, at the business of running a household on a specific and usually modest sum. And yet she was being met by something more sophisticated than herself. Not because she was weak, but because the resources arrayed against her careful management were extraordinary, the full depth of psychology, of architecture, of sensory design, of behavioral study. The supermarket she shopped in every week had been built around an understanding of her desires, her habits, and her vulnerabilities that had been developed through tens of thousands of hours of observation and analysis. She was the subject, and the subject never sees the study. She came home with 23 items. She had written 14 on her list. She put things away in the kitchen, working efficiently in a space she knew perfectly, and she felt, on the whole, that she had done well. She had been a good shopper. She had chosen carefully. She had. And someone else had chosen carefully too. Her name is something like Dorothy, or Margaret, or Joan. She was born in the early 1920s, which means she came of age during the Depression and married after the war, and these two facts have shaped her relationship with money in ways she could not fully articulate and does not think about directly. She knows what it is to have very little. She knows what it is to make do, to stretch a chicken across 3 meals, to eat the ends of the bread first and save the soft middle for the children. That knowledge lives in her body like weather, constant and mostly unspoken. She is 29 or 33 or 36 years old in 1954. She has 2 or 3 children. She lives in a house that is new or almost new, in a neighborhood that is also new, with streets that still smell faintly of fresh asphalt and yards where the grass is only beginning to look like it belongs. Her husband works in an office or a factory or a shop, and his salary covers the house payment and the car payment and the grocery money and the monthly bills, and sometimes at the end of the month there is a little left and sometimes there is not. The grocery budget is hers to manage. This is not a small responsibility. A family of 4 in 1954 spends between $25 and $40 a week on food, depending on the size of the house and the habits of the family and the generosity of the husband. This sum is close to what many women of the previous generation spent in a month. It is real money, and she handles it seriously. She keeps a running list on the pad of paper by the telephone. During the week, as things run low or are used up, she writes them down: coffee, canned tomatoes, detergent, the cereal her youngest will eat and the kind his brother won't. She transfers the important items to her shopping list before she leaves the house, organizing them, sometimes, by the order she moves through the store, because she has been going to the same store long enough to know its geography the way she knows her own kitchen. This is mastery, of a particular and undervalued kind. The grocery store is her professional domain. She knows which cuts of meat represent the best value for the week's money, which brands can be substituted without complaint, which canned goods are indistinguishable from each other despite a 15-cent price difference. She knows when something is on sale because the price is genuinely reduced and when something is marked down because it is close to expiring. She has learned the rhythms of the store's promotions, and she plans around them. And yet the store is learning her too. This is the asymmetry at the heart of the 1950s supermarket. She is skilled and experienced and thoughtful, and the store is all of those things plus something more: organized, studied, deliberately designed to exceed her skill. The floor plan is not neutral. The lighting is not neutral. The music, the smells, the height of the shelves, the size of the cart, none of it is neutral. Each element has been considered in relation to the shopper, which is to say in relation to her, and each element has been calibrated to produce a particular effect. Dichter understood something about her that the stores had also begun to understand, that her relationship with shopping was tangled up with her sense of herself as a good wife and a good mother, and that this tangle could be worked. A woman who bought the better brand of flour felt, in some small way, that she was offering her family the better version of what she made with it. A woman who bought the cake mix with the picture of the happy birthday child on the box was buying, in part, the image on the box, the feeling it evoked, the small warmth of it. These were not irrational purchases. They were purchases made in full contact with something real, the desire to give her family something good, the desire to feel, in the small daily acts of provisioning, that she was doing her work well. The stores knew this. The manufacturers knew this. The copy on the packages spoke to it directly, the detergent that would give her family whiter shirts, which was to say, a family that presented itself well to the world, which was to say, a family that reflected well on her. The bread that would build strong children. The margarine that the doctors recommended. Each product arrived with an implicit argument about what kind of woman used it and what kind of family she was keeping. She was not stupid about any of this. She read the packages with some skepticism. She compared prices. She substituted. But she was also susceptible to it, not because she was weak but because the argument touched something true. She did want her family to be well, she did find meaning in this daily work of feeding and tending, she did take a kind of pride in a well-stocked kitchen and a well-fed household. The advertising had simply learned to speak directly to the feelings that were already there. On Saturday morning, she locks the front door behind her and backs the car out of the driveway. The children are with a neighbor, or they are in school, or she has brought the youngest in the car and he sits in the passenger seat with his hands in his lap, looking out the window at the houses going by. The store is 6 minutes away. She knows this without thinking about it. She pulls into the parking lot, which is vast and recently paved and still slightly exciting to her, the way any convenience feels exciting when you remember what came before it. She takes a cart from the line outside the automatic doors. The doors open with a small rush of air. Inside, the music is already playing, something with strings, something comfortable and formless. She pauses for a moment in the produce section and squeezes an orange, testing its weight. She has her list. She has her pocketbook. She is entirely capable and entirely in command, and she is exactly where the architects and the psychologists and the manufacturers have arranged for her to be, moving down the aisle on the schedule they have designed, her eye finding the things they have placed for it to find. She will do this for the next 30 years. The store will change around her, growing larger, adding new categories, responding to new research. But the basic dynamic will remain, her skill against the store's design, her intention against the floor plan's intention, and usually, most days, on most shopping trips, the store will come out a little ahead. She does not know this, and would perhaps not care if she did. She came in for bread and butter, and she found them, and she found several other things besides, and she is heading toward the checkout lane with a full cart and a quiet sense of satisfaction that is, in its own way, completely genuine. Before the supermarket, there was the corner store, and before the corner store, there was the merchant's cart, and before the merchant's cart there was the market square, and the market square was as old as the city itself. What the 1950s supermarket represented was not the invention of commerce but the reorganization of it, a compression and acceleration and rationalization of something that had always existed, refashioned around the automobile and the suburb and the refrigerator and the idea that time was something to be saved. The first true supermarket is generally credited to Michael Cullen, who opened King Cullen in Jamaica, Queens, in 1930. He had proposed the concept to his employer, Kroger, in a letter so specific and so visionary that Kroger's management decided he must be unhinged and did not respond. Cullen opened his own store on the ground floor of an abandoned garage, with parking outside, and sold groceries at prices so far below the prevailing rate that customers drove from other boroughs to fill their cars. He understood the basic economics of volume: sell enough of something cheaply enough and the profit on each unit becomes irrelevant. What matters is the aggregate. Where a small grocery might sell 2 cases of canned soup in a week, Cullen's store sold several hundred. The margin on each can was thin, but the number of cans made it work. He called himself the world's greatest price wrecker, which was also the title of an advertising pamphlet he distributed to customers, and the name was apt. The Depression made his timing fortunate in a grim way. Americans who had been spending freely in the 1920s had stopped spending freely and were now looking for every possible savings. A store that could sell a can of tomatoes for 3 cents less than the corner market was a store worth driving to, and Americans were already learning to organize their lives around driving. The car was transforming geography. The suburb was beginning its great expansion outward from the city centers, and the suburban landscape that was emerging had neither the corner stores of the old urban neighborhoods nor the rural general stores of the countryside. It had, or would soon have, parking lots. The A&P had been the dominant grocery chain in America since the late 19th century, with thousands of small, neighborhood-scale stores where a woman could walk in, hand her list to the man behind the counter, and wait while he assembled her order. This model had its virtues. The shopkeeper knew his customers. He extended credit. He could be bargained with. But it was slow, and it required significant labor, and it positioned the customer as a passive recipient of service rather than an active chooser of goods. Self-service was the supermarket's revolution, and it was more profound than it sounds. When you chose your own goods from a shelf rather than reciting a list to a clerk, you became an agent in the transaction in a way you had not been before. You moved through the space. You made decisions. You could take your time or you could hurry, you could compare prices or you could grab what was familiar, you could change your mind mid-aisle without embarrassing anyone. The self-service store gave the shopper a kind of freedom, and freedom, as Dichter had noted, was exactly what the 1950s housewife was most hungry for. But it also gave the store a new power. In a clerk-served store, the merchant's judgment mediated between the goods and the customer. If a clerk pushed a particular brand, customers bought it. If he said nothing about one product and recommended another, the recommendation mattered. The self-service store removed this mediator and put the goods and the customer face to face, which meant that the goods themselves had to do the selling. Packaging, placement, display, these became the clerks that never tired, never had an off day, never pushed the wrong product by mistake. They were always there, and they were always saying exactly what they had been designed to say. By 1952, there were roughly 15,000 supermarkets in the United States, each with more than $1 million in annual sales. The number would grow steadily through the decade. The stores were getting larger, their aisles wider, their parking lots bigger, their inventories more comprehensive. A supermarket in 1955 might carry 4,000 separate items. By the early 1960s, that number would be on its way to 10,000. The category of things that could be bought under one fluorescent roof was expanding with the prosperity of the decade. The chains competed with each other on price and on cleanliness and on the friendliness of their clerks at the checkout, and increasingly on the quality of their stores as physical environments. A&P, Kroger, Safeway, Food Fair, each had its style, its regional identity, its particular arrangement of the standard categories. But they all shared the same fundamental architecture, the same basic logic of produce at the entrance and staples at the back and impulse items at the checkout, because the research was pointing toward the same conclusions everywhere it was conducted. The local independent grocery was a casualty of this era. Neighborhood stores that had served specific communities for generations found it difficult to compete with the price power and the square footage of the chains. Some survived by specializing, by knowing their customers and stocking things the chains did not bother with. Others closed. The butcher and the baker and the greengrocer, who had each occupied their own storefront in the old neighborhood shopping street, were not being replaced by the supermarket so much as absorbed into it, their functions reduced to departments in a larger enterprise. What was lost in this consolidation was hard to quantify. The corner store had been a social space as well as a commercial one, a place where you could have a conversation about the quality of the week's apples, where the shopkeeper might hold something back for a regular customer, where the transaction was embedded in a relationship that extended beyond the sale. The supermarket was efficient, well-lit, well-stocked, and socially neutral. You did not have a relationship with the store. You had a cart. There were women who preferred it this way, who found the old model confining, the clerk's attention a form of surveillance, the shopkeeper's knowledge of your purchasing habits a kind of intimacy that assumed a familiarity you had not offered. The supermarket's anonymity was genuinely freeing for some shoppers. No one was watching. No one was keeping score. You could stand in front of the coffee for 3 minutes deciding between brands without anyone making a face about it. And yet the anonymity was partial. Someone was watching. Not the clerk, not a person at all, but the arrangement of the store itself, the placement of the goods, the calibration of the lights, the tempo of the music, all of it watching, all of it keeping score, all of it accumulating its own kind of knowledge about how women shopped and what they chose and what they reached for first. The package is doing its work before you pick it up. This is the first thing to understand about mid-century American packaging, which was entering its golden age in the early 1950s, when graphic designers, industrial designers, and psychologists began collaborating in earnest on the science of the shelf. The package had to perform in 3 seconds or less, had to catch an eye already moving, had to distinguish itself from the packages on either side, had to communicate warmth and trust and value in the time it took a hand to pause and a decision to form. Before the rise of the supermarket, packaging had been largely functional, a container that protected its contents and identified its manufacturer. The box or can or wax paper wrapper told you what was inside and who had made it, and beyond that it aspired to very little. The manufacturer did not need to sell through the package, because the clerk behind the counter was selling for him. Self-service changed everything. Now the package was the only salesperson, and it had to do the full job: attract attention, communicate quality, make a case, close the sale. The major brands began pouring money into their packaging design, hiring firms that had emerged from the advertising boom of the 1940s, firms with research departments that conducted focus groups and shelf simulation studies and color psychology experiments. The result was a revolution in how American goods looked, a visual language that was still being codified and debated and refined through the whole of the 1950s. Color was the most immediate tool. At a distance of 20 feet, which was approximately the distance from which a shopper first registered a section of shelving, color was all that was visible. Shape came next, then typeface, then image, then the fine print of the label. The hierarchy of perception drove packaging design: get the color right first, because the color was the flag that signaled from across the aisle. Campbell's red and white, which had been introduced in the 1890s, was already so established by the 1950s that it was less a design choice than a landmark. You did not look for the Campbell's label, you looked for the red and white, and your eye found it the way your eye finds a familiar face in a crowd. Morton Salt's blue and white girl in the rain. Del Monte's green and gold. The colors of the major brands were doing something that went beyond communication. They were building memory structures in the minds of consumers, creating associations that deepened with every repetition until the color and the brand were essentially the same thing. New products arriving on the shelves in the 1950s had to navigate this established visual landscape. A new brand of canned vegetable might choose to stand next to Del Monte in color, implying quality by association, or it might choose to contrast, to stand out through difference. Both strategies had proponents in the design world, and both had studies behind them. The debates in packaging meetings of the early 1950s were genuinely interesting, and genuinely stakes-laden. A wrong color choice could doom a product before anyone had tasted it. Imagery on packages told its own stories. The farm wife appeared constantly, suggesting a domestic origin for the product that was almost always fictional by 1954. The farm where the vegetables were actually grown was a large commercial operation, harvested by machines and processed in industrial facilities. The farm wife on the label was a dream of the farm, a reassurance that something rural and honest and personal stood behind the product. Consumers understood this on some level and accepted it on another level, the way one accepts the conventions of fiction. The story is not true, but the feeling it produces is real enough to matter. Children appeared on packaging for products aimed at mothers. The happy birthday cake on the cake mix box. The grinning child with the cereal bowl. The toddler with the jar of strained peas. These images worked on the mother's identification with her child, her desire to give the child something good, her recognition of the child's pleasure as her own pleasure. A product that made your child happy was a product that made you successful in one of your most important roles. The package was selling not to her appetite but to her love. Doctors appeared on products in the health and nutrition categories, lending authority to claims that were often less well supported than the white coat implied. Margarine was recommended by doctors at a time when the science of dietary fat was genuinely unsettled and the comparison between butter and margarine was contested by nutritionists as well as by the dairy industry. Cereal makers cited vitamins and minerals. Soup manufacturers invoked warmth and convalescence. the old association between broth and recovery. The authority of medicine was available for purchase, and it was purchased. Dichter had found that the image on a package could establish what he called a pre-experience, a feeling about the product that preceded any actual experience of it, that shaded the experience when it came. A woman who bought a bread that showed a warm, golden, sliced loaf on the wrapper arrived home with an expectation that the bread would be warm and golden, and that expectation colored the experience of opening the bag and smelling the bread and tasting it. She was, in part, tasting the package. This sounds abstract, but it is simply the mechanism by which expectation shapes perception, a mechanism well documented in psychology and exploited with considerable skill in packaging design. The package also offered a model of femininity. The women depicted on household product packaging in the 1950s were almost uniformly cheerful, neat, slender, and elegantly dressed for housework, which is to say dressed in clothes that signal domestic competence rather than domestic labor, the fitted waist, the flared skirt, the pearl earrings. They appeared in settings that were modern and well-equipped and orderly. They did not look tired. They did not look harried. They smiled at the product in their hands the way one smiles at a gift. This was aspirational imagery, and Dichter understood that aspiration was as powerful as desire, perhaps more powerful, because aspiration pointed toward what the shopper wanted to become rather than what she simply wanted to have. A woman who bought the right floor wax was not just buying a clean floor, she was buying membership in the category of women who kept clean floors, who had the right product, who were doing the job the right way. The package sold the floor wax and sold the self-image simultaneously. The self at checkout paid for both. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The coupon arrived in the Sunday paper, folded into the advertising supplement between the colored comic strips and the department store inserts. She clipped it on Sunday evening, after the dishes were done, while the television played in the other room. She used small scissors with a red handle, the kind kept in the kitchen drawer alongside the string and the birthday candles, and she cut along the dotted lines with care, because a torn coupon was an embarrassment at the checkout. Coupons were not new in 1954. Coca-Cola had used them as early as 1887, distributing tickets for a free glass of the new syrup to passers-by in Atlanta. C.W. Post had used them to introduce grape nuts in the 1890s. But in the post-war supermarket era, the coupon was becoming something more elaborate and more studied, a marketing instrument with its own science, deployed by manufacturers and retailers with considerable strategic precision. The coupon offered savings. This was genuine. A 15-cent coupon on a box of cereal that retailed for 32 cents represented almost a 50% discount, and the woman clipping it at the kitchen table was not wrong to feel that she was doing something practical and intelligent. She was. The savings were real money. In a household where the grocery budget was managed carefully, coupons were a legitimate tool of financial management, and the women who used them most systematically, keeping them in envelopes organized by category, planning their shopping trips around which coupons were expiring that week, were doing skilled work. The manufacturers who issued the coupons were not, however, being simply generous. The coupon had multiple functions, not all of them obvious to the woman who clipped it. The primary function was trial, getting a new product into a shopper's basket for the first time, overcoming the inertia of brand loyalty by making the price low enough that the risk of trying something unfamiliar seemed worth it. A woman who had bought the same brand of canned soup for 6 years was not going to switch to a new brand without a reason. The coupon was the reason. Once she had tried the new brand and found it acceptable, the manufacturer hoped she would return to it at full price. The economics of this worked if the new product was genuinely better or if the first purchase had created a habit strong enough to persist without further incentive. Dichter had found that the psychology of habit was powerful in grocery shopping, that women returned to brands that had worked without much active thought, that the decision to buy was often the decision not to decide, to take the thing that had been taken before. The coupon tried to install a new habit over an old one. The coupon also functioned as a form of market research. Each coupon redemption was a data point: this product was bought at this location on this day. The aggregate of many redemptions told manufacturers which geographic markets were responding to which products, which stores had which customer demographics, which promotions were working and which were not. This information was valuable, and the cost of the discount that produced it was a form of payment for the data. For the shopper, the coupon created a particular relationship with thrift that was psychologically interesting. Dichter had examined this relationship and found that it produced something he called the coupon paradox. The woman who clipped coupons was demonstrating financial prudence, and this demonstration of prudence freed her to spend more than she would have otherwise. She had earned, in some emotional accounting, the right to an indulgence. She had saved 15 cents on the soup. She could allow herself the box of cookies she had not planned to buy. Retailers understood this dynamic and reinforced it. Stores that heavily promoted coupon acceptance also tended to feature indulgent items near the checkout, knowing that a shopper who had just saved money at the register was in the psychological state most likely to add an unplanned purchase in the final moments of the trip. The checkout lane display was designed for the shopper who had just finished being careful. There were women who could not be moved by any of this, who went to the store with their list and their coupons and came home with what they had intended to buy and nothing more, whose self-discipline was ironclad, who regarded the supermarket as a utility rather than an experience. These women existed. But they were a smaller proportion of shoppers than the industry feared and a larger proportion than the shoppers themselves believed they were. Most women fell somewhere between the extreme of perfect efficiency and the extreme of total susceptibility. Most found themselves reaching, occasionally, for things they had not planned to buy. Most added items to the cart in the moment of encounter that they might have declined to add if asked about them at home an hour before. This was not weakness. It was the normal operation of human desire in a space that had been carefully optimized to encounter it. The coupon was, in the end, a small gesture of reciprocity in a relationship that was otherwise entirely one-directional. The manufacturer gives you a discount, you give the manufacturer your trial. The retailer gives you a reason to feel smart, you give the retailer your attention for an extra few minutes at the checkout. The transactions were real. The savings were real. And the asymmetry of the relationship, the fact that one party had studied the other in tremendous depth and the other had not studied the first party at all, was real too. She put the clipped coupons in an envelope and the envelope in her pocketbook, in the same compartment as the shopping list. In the morning she would go to the store, and she would use most of the coupons, and a few she would forget because she had not bought the right things to go with them, and next week there would be new coupons to clip, and the rhythm would continue, the small weekly ceremony of scissors and dotted lines and the feeling of doing something smart with money. The envelope was a little lighter when she came home. The grocery bags were a little heavier than she had expected. Both of these things were true at the same time. The child seat at the front of the shopping cart was added to Sylvan Goldman's original 1937 design after manufacturers realized that the child in the store was a complication, and that a complication could be managed. A child who sat in the cart could not run. A child who could not run could not knock over a pyramid of canned goods or pull a low-shelf display down on themselves or disappear into the cereal aisle while their mother was occupied with the butter. The child's seat was a practical solution to a practical problem. It was also, from the manufacturer's perspective, an opportunity. A child seated at the front of the cart, facing outward, at the precise height of the lower middle shelves, was a pair of eyes at a particular elevation, and that elevation was studied. What did a child at that height see? What attracted a child's attention? What made a child reach, and what made a child ask, and what made a child persist in asking until the asking became its own kind of weight? The answer, developed through observation and refined through the decade, involved color, shape, and recognition. Children were drawn to primary colors, particularly red and yellow. They were drawn to cartoon characters, to familiar faces, to images that connected with something they knew from television or from the comic books that were appearing in increasing numbers on the magazine rack near the checkout. They were drawn to novelty and to the suggestion of fun, to boxes that promised a prize inside or a picture to collect. The Saturday morning television programs of the early 1950s were beginning to transform children's relationship with brand identity. A child who watched a particular program would also watch the commercials that accompanied it, and those commercials would show a particular cereal or a particular cracker, and the child would form an association between the pleasure of the program and the product on the screen, and when the child sat in the cart at the lower middle height of the supermarket shelving, the recognizable cereal box would call out with the familiar warmth of something already loved. Mothers were aware of this. Most of them were not pleased by it. But awareness did not fully immunize against it, because the child did not ask once and accept no, the child asked in the way that children ask, with repetition and escalation and the particular acoustic quality of a child's voice in a public space. The mother who said no in the cereal aisle often found herself saying yes at the checkout, or saying yes to the crackers in exchange for quiet on the rest of the trip, or simply reaching for the brightly colored box in the moment when saying no had become more expensive than the box itself. Dichter had studied this dynamic and found it one of the more complex in the grocery store ecology. Mothers felt guilty about the child's desire because they had been told, by pediatricians and by the new literature of child psychology that was filtering into popular magazines, that giving in to a child's demands was a form of poor parenting. But they also felt guilty about saying no, about denying the child something it wanted, about being the kind of mother who went to the grocery store and came home empty-handed. The guilt ran in both directions, and the manufacturers had learned to position their products at the intersection of these two guilts. A cereal that was fortified with vitamins and promoted on television with a cartoon character was hitting both marks simultaneously. The mother who bought it could tell herself she was buying it for the nutrition, which was real, and her child could understand her as buying it for the character, which was also real. The transaction satisfied multiple needs at once, which is always the most efficient kind of transaction, from the seller's perspective. There were products specifically designed for the child in the cart, items scaled to small hands and packaged in bright colors and positioned at seat height on the shelving. Fruit snacks and individual juice boxes and small packages of crackers designed to be held and eaten, or attempted to be eaten, by a 2-year-old in a cart seat. These were not nutritional priorities. They were peace offerings, small sweet things that brought quiet and cooperative forward motion through the store. The child learned the supermarket early. Before she could read, she knew the shapes and colors of the packages she wanted. She knew the red of the ketchup and the blue of the macaroni box and the yellow of the butter wrapper. She knew these the way she knew the faces of the people she loved, not by analysis but by accumulated recognition, by the repetition of seeing the same thing every week in the same place, until the shape was as familiar as a room in her own house. By the time she was old enough to walk alongside the cart rather than ride in it, she was navigating the store with a sophistication she could not have explained. She knew where the cookies were. She knew which end of the cereal aisle had the interesting boxes and which end had the plain ones. She knew that the checkout lane was where you asked for things, that the moment of waiting was a moment that might yield something, that the small impulse purchases near the register were negotiable in a way that the items deeper in the store were not. She was learning the grammar of the supermarket. In 10 or 15 years, she would be the one pushing the cart, and the industry would have spent those years studying her generation with the same intensity it had brought to studying her mother, learning what this new cohort of consumers wanted and feared and hoped for, calibrating the shelving and the packaging and the music to the particular frequencies of her particular decade. But for now she was small, and she was in the cart seat, and she was pointing at something on the lower middle shelf with the authority of someone who has no doubt at all about what she wants. Her mother looked at the box. It was a reasonable request, honestly. The child had been good this morning. The box went into the cart. The TV dinner appeared in American supermarkets in 1953, in an aluminum tray divided into 3 compartments: turkey slices, cornbread dressing, peas. It cost 98 cents. The company that made it, Swanson, had a problem: too many turkeys left over from Thanksgiving, 12 million pounds of turkey sitting in refrigerated railroad cars with nowhere to go. A young salesman named Jerry Thomas looked at the trays that airlines were using to serve meals at altitude, and he had a thought. Within a year, Swanson was selling 10 million TV dinners annually. Within 3 years, they were selling 25 million. The product had touched something real in American domestic life: the desire for ease, and the desire for its opposite, the desire to feel that you had made something, even when the something had come out of a tray and gone into the oven for 25 minutes and emerged in its aluminum compartments, each item separate from the others, the peas unmixed with the dressing. The 1950s supermarket was the distribution mechanism for a transformation in American eating that went far deeper than the TV dinner. Convenience food was not new. Canned goods had been part of the American diet since the Civil War, and commercial bread had been available since before the First World War. But the scale and variety of convenience food accelerated dramatically in the post-war decade, driven by several forces arriving simultaneously: the returning veterans who had grown accustomed to efficient institutional feeding, the suburban housewives who had often worked during the war and were not necessarily trained cooks, the refrigerators and freezers that were becoming standard household equipment, and the manufacturers who were eager to sell products with higher margins than raw commodities. Frozen food, in particular, changed the weekly shopping trip. Before widespread home freezer availability, a woman shopped for fresh food several times a week, buying only what she would cook in the next day or two. The freezer allowed her to shop once a week or even less often, to buy in bulk, to stock up. This convenience was genuine, and it was also commercially useful. A shopper who was buying for a week bought more at each visit. The cart that needed to last 7 days was a different, heavier cart than the one that needed to last 2. The frozen food section of the supermarket was a relatively new addition in 1954, occupying a long row of chest freezers or upright display cases along one wall, their glass lids fogged with cold, their contents arranged in the bright primary colors that designers had learned would penetrate the frosted glass. Frozen vegetables had improved significantly from the wooden, texturally unpleasant products of the early freezing era. Frozen dinners were still novelties but were selling with remarkable speed. Frozen orange juice concentrate, introduced in 1948, had already become a staple in many households, offering Florida orange juice in February, in Minnesota, at a price that the fresh fruit could not match. The cake mix occupied a category of its own, sitting at the intersection of convenience and domestic performance. It was the product that had produced Ernest Dichter's most famous finding, the one about adding the egg. The cake mix manufacturers had initially formulated their products to require only water, making them as simple as possible, reducing the work to almost nothing. What they found was that they sold poorly. Women who used them felt somehow implicated in an inadequacy, as if using a mix meant acknowledging that real baking was beyond them. When the formulation was changed to require an egg, and sometimes a measure of oil or milk, sales improved dramatically. The process now required something from the baker. She was not merely a conduit for the manufacturer's work, she was a participant. The egg she cracked into the bowl was her contribution, and the cake that came out of the oven was, in some small but real sense, hers. The mix had given her a collaborator rather than a replacement. The distinction mattered enormously. Processed food of the 1950s was honest about what it was doing in some respects and not honest in others. It was honest about convenience, which it advertised loudly and prominently. It was less honest about nutrition, which it claimed in terms that the science did not always support, and about the relationship between its products and the home-cooked originals they were meant to replace or supplement. The copy on a frozen pot pie box implied a connection to the pot pies that grandmothers had made from scratch, a continuity of domestic tradition that the manufacturing process had essentially severed. But the 1950s housewife was not necessarily deceived by this. She understood that a frozen pot pie was not her grandmother's pot pie. What she valued was that it could be on the table in 45 minutes on a Tuesday evening when she had done the laundry and helped with the homework, and the time between arriving home from whatever errand she had been running and the moment her husband expected dinner was not enough to construct a pot pie from raw materials. The frozen pot pie was not an illusion of home cooking. It was a practical tool in a life of considerable demands. Convenience food also shaped what the supermarket looked like as a physical space. The frozen food section required infrastructure, the chest freezers, the display cases, the plumbing and electrical work to maintain them. The dry goods sections expanded to accommodate the growing variety of boxed and canned products. The dairy section evolved as more dairy products became available in supermarket formats. The store that Sylvan Goldman had opened in a garage in 1930 bore almost no resemblance to the modern supermarket of 1954, in size, in complexity, in the variety of what it offered. The housewife who walked through the automatic doors in 1954 was entering a space that had not existed a generation before, buying products that had not been invented when she was a child, using a cart that had not been designed until she was a teenager. She was an early adopter, in the contemporary phrase, of an entire system of food distribution and domestic management that was still working out its logic as she moved through it. She was also feeding a family. This was the ground truth under all of it, under the psychology and the architecture and the packaging and the coupon clipping and the product development. Someone was going to eat what she put in the cart. Someone was going to eat dinner tonight and breakfast tomorrow and lunch after that, and it was her job to provide it, and she took the job seriously, and the frozen pot pie on the Tuesday night when time was short was not a failure of that seriousness but an expression of it. She had found the thing that would work, and she had brought it home, and it would be eaten. The store understood this, or at least its designers did, which is why the most effective supermarket marketing of the era always came back to family. The family sitting around the dinner table. The child smiling over a bowl. The husband served something good at the end of a long day. The woman in the center of all of it, competent and unhurried and pleased with herself, holding a product that had made it possible. She had made it possible. The product had helped. This was the story that sold, because it was, in its essentials, true. You arrive at the checkout lane with more than you plan to buy, and this is so ordinary, so standard a feature of the shopping trip, that you do not think of it as an event. The cart has become heavier than when you started, and the arithmetic of what is in it against what you wrote on the list is an arithmetic you do not do too precisely, because doing it too precisely would require a response you are not ready to make. You have bought what seemed right. Some things that were on the list, and some things that were not, and the total will be what it is. The checkout lane is the last built environment you move through on your shopping trip, and it has been designed with the same care that went into every other inch of the store. It is narrower than the aisles, which is deliberate. The narrowness directs you forward, channels movement, prevents the browsing that characterizes the open aisles. You are here to complete a transaction, and the physical space cooperates with that purpose. But it also does one more thing before it lets you go. On both sides of the lane, from the moment you enter to the moment you reach the register, are small items. Gum in its tightly packed rack, spearmint, peppermint, juicy fruit, double mint. Candy bars, Snickers, Milky Way, Mounds, Almond Joy, the chocolate smelling faintly sweet even in its wrapper, the wrappers bright enough to register even in peripheral vision. Magazines, Life, Look, Ladies' Home Journal, TV Guide with its small format and its reassuring television faces. Cigarettes behind the register, stacked in their cartons. Aspirin and small first aid items. Batteries. Shoe polish. These are not random assemblages. Each category in the checkout lane has been evaluated for its checkout lane performance, which means its performance in the specific conditions of captive attention and short time horizon that characterize the lane. An item placed in the checkout lane must be small enough to add to a full cart without drama, inexpensive enough to buy without deliberation, and desirable enough to attract a hand that has been controlling itself for the last 40 minutes. Gum meets all three criteria. It is the size of a flat pack, it costs a nickel, and it tastes good. The smell of peppermint was enough. In studies conducted by the candy manufacturers, to trigger a desire that a shopper could not quite account for. She did not walk into the store wanting gum. She walked past the gum and wanted it, the way you want something only when you see it, which is a different kind of want from the kind that gets written on a list. The candy bar operated on a similar mechanism, augmented by the particular relationship between waiting and reward. Waiting is uncomfortable. The human nervous system registers the discomfort of a line as a mild stress, and mild stress creates an appetite for comfort, and candy is one of the oldest human comforts, its sweetness a signal that goes below the level of thought into something more basic. The checkout line and the candy bar were not accidentally adjacent. They had been placed in relationship with each other deliberately, in full understanding of how the one would affect the desire for the other. The magazine served a different purpose. A woman who picked up a magazine at the checkout was a woman who was not calculating the total of her cart or reconsidering any of her purchases. She was looking at the magazine. The magazine was entertainment, the same entertainment that had brought radio and then television into the home, a small door out of one's own concerns and into a world of other things. At the checkout, with nothing to do but wait, the magazine was irresistible in the most literal sense. There was no resistance to offer it, no competing activity, no reason not to look. The checkout counter itself was elevated, positioned at a height that required the shopper to lift her goods from the cart to the belt. Lifting goods gave the shopper a sense of each item's physical weight, but it also, psychologically, gave each item a moment of individual attention. When you lifted the soup can from the cart to the belt, you held the soup can, you confirmed its presence, you in some small sense chose it again. This rechoosing was mostly unconscious, but it reduced the incidence of regret at checkout, the moment when a shopper looked at what she was about to pay for and returned something to the store. Regret at checkout was the industry's term for it, and it was the event they most wanted to prevent. The cashier was part of the checkout experience too, one of the few human interactions in a shopping trip that had been designed to minimize them. She was trained to be efficient and pleasant, to make eye contact and use the customer's name if a store loyalty card was presented, to suggest an item that the customer might have forgotten, not in a high-pressure way but in the way that a friend who worked in a store might suggest it. Have you tried the new crackers? They've been very popular this week. This was a studied friendliness, trained and calibrated, designed to produce warmth without the inefficiency of actual conversation. The cashier had been told exactly how long a transaction should take, and she managed her warmth within that window. She knew her job was to make the customer feel, in the final moments of the shopping trip, that she had been seen and welcomed, that the store valued her specifically, that she was more than a cart to be emptied and a bill to be paid. Most shoppers left feeling reasonably good. This was by design also. The architecture of the checkout was the architecture of closure and satisfaction, the cart emptied, the groceries bagged and stacked, the receipt handed over, the sum of the week's provisioning contained in a number and a stack of brown paper bags. The number was larger than planned, most weeks, but the bags were satisfying to look at, dense and full of good things. She carried them to the car in 2 trips and arranged them carefully in the trunk, heavier items on the bottom, eggs on top, the bread kept to one side where it would not be crushed. She had been doing this for years. She knew how bags went into a trunk, and she moved through it quickly, and when the trunk was shut she stood for a moment in the parking lot in the full light of the morning before getting into the car. The store behind her hummed with refrigeration and music and the soft rolling of carts on polished floors. Inside, another woman had just taken a cart from the line and was moving into the produce section, her hand finding an orange without quite deciding to find it, the morning just beginning, the list in her pocketbook, the store arranged around her like a gift. She was not entirely without awareness. This is important to say, because the story of the 1950s supermarket is sometimes told as a story of passive women manipulated by clever men, and this is only partly true, and the part that is not true is important. She knew the store was trying to sell her things. She was not naive about commerce. She had grown up during the Depression and been shaped by it in ways that included a healthy skepticism toward anyone who seemed too eager to make her spend money. She knew the bread was at the back and why. She had long since mapped the store's strategy in her own mind, had developed countermeasures, had learned to shop with a kind of brisk efficiency on busy days that was its own form of resistance. She could move through a grocery store on a Tuesday morning and come out the other side having bought only what was on her list if she wanted to, if she was in the mood, if the budget was genuinely tight and the week's arithmetic left no room for anything extra. But she did not always want to. And here is where the psychology of the supermarket found its real purchase, not in deceiving women, but in creating an environment where desire was easy to follow. The store did not make her buy the jam. It made the jam easy to notice, easy to reach, easy to decide in favor of, in the half-second when the hand was already moving toward the shelf and the decision was less a decision than a continuation of something already in motion. Dichter had found, in his long hours of interview, that women had a sophisticated understanding of their own ambivalence about shopping. They knew they bought things they had not planned to buy. They knew they were affected by display and packaging and the smell of baking bread. They were not fooled about this. What they were was human, which is to say they were beings who responded to their environment even when they knew their environment was trying to produce a response. Many women found the supermarket genuinely pleasant. This is also important. The fluorescent light and the well-stocked shelves and the warmth compared to the outdoor cold, the music and the orderly categories and the sense of abundance all around, these were agreeable things to be surrounded by. Shopping for the family was not always a chore, it was sometimes, on the right day with the right mood, a pleasure, a walk through a world that was offering things and leaving the choosing to you. The choosing was real. Whatever the psychology of display and placement, the woman in the grocery store made dozens of genuine decisions in the course of a shopping trip, and these decisions reflected her knowledge of her family's tastes, her budget, her sense of what constituted quality, her personal aesthetics of food and home. No amount of clever packaging could make her buy a product her family disliked, or make her ignore a product her family loved just because it was not well displayed. She had her own criteria, and she applied them. She also had the ability to develop immunity over time. A product that caught her eye on the first encounter became a familiar object on the third, and familiarity reduced the charge of novelty that had made it interesting. The store needed to keep changing, keep introducing new products and new displays and new seasonal arrangements, precisely because the shopper who had seen it all before was harder to surprise. The industry's need for constant novelty was, in a sense, a tribute to the shopper's adaptability. What the women of the 1950s did not have was a word for what was being done to them. The vocabulary for thinking about consumer manipulation as a systematic practice was not yet in wide circulation. It would not really arrive until Vance Packard published The Hidden Persuaders in 1957, a book that described motivational research and its commercial applications in terms accessible to a general audience. Packard's book became a bestseller, which suggested that many Americans were ready to think critically about the techniques being used to influence their purchasing behavior. But even before Packard's vocabulary was available, women had their own vernacular for the dynamic. They talked about the store getting you, about going in for one thing and coming out with a whole bag of things you didn't plan on. They talked about the trap of the sale display, about the cereal their child had seen on television and would not stop asking for. They talked about standing in front of the jam and not knowing why they'd put it in the cart. The experience was familiar, the framework for analyzing it was still forming. What they did with this awareness varied considerably. Some women used it to regulate themselves more carefully, to approach the store with a heightened vigilance that kept the cart closer to the list. Others accepted the gap between intention and purchase as simply part of how shopping worked, a predictable tax on the experience of moving through a well-stocked store in a prosperous time. Most did something between these poles, some combination of discipline and surrender that felt like their own idiosyncratic relationship with the grocery store rather than a predictable response to a designed environment. They were right that it felt personal. The response was theirs. The store had created the conditions, but the choice was still made by the particular woman, with her particular history and her particular budget and her particular feeling on that particular Tuesday morning. No two shopping trips were identical, even in the same store with the same list. The woman was too variable, too complex, too genuinely herself to be fully captured by any design. This was what Dichter had found in his interviews, too, in the end, that women were more complicated than the industry liked to think, more aware, more resistant, more capable of surprising behavior. The motivational research could identify tendencies, could map probabilities, could increase the likelihood of a desired outcome. But it could not guarantee it. It was working with human beings, and human beings retained, even in the most carefully designed environments, the capacity to do something unexpected. She put the extra jar of jam on the counter and her husband opened it at breakfast and said it was good, and she said yes, she'd picked it up at the store, and he said that was nice, and the conversation moved on to other things, and the jar was put away and finished over the course of several weeks, and at no point did anyone discuss whether it had been necessary, or whether she had been moved to buy it by a display she had not quite understood herself. It had been good jam. That was enough. In the old corner store, you knew the shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper knew you. In the butcher's shop, the man behind the glass case could tell you which cut had come in fresh that morning and which had been there since yesterday, and you trusted him because he was a specific person in a specific relationship with you, not a stranger but a figure in the landscape of your daily life, someone whose family you knew and whose store you had been coming to since before your marriage. The supermarket replaced this with something different and not quite equivalent. The store was large and anonymous. The cashier was friendly but temporary, likely to be replaced by someone else on a different shift, part of a workforce that turned over with the regularity of the seasons. The clerks who stocked the shelves were often invisible, working early in the morning before the store opened, or late at night. The person you interacted with was the checkout cashier, and the interaction lasted 3 minutes. And yet the supermarket had its own social life, and women found it. They found each other in the aisles. The grocery store of the 1950s was one of the primary gathering spaces of the suburb, one of the few places where a woman who spent her days at home with children could reliably encounter other women like herself, in a neutral space, without the social obligations that went with visiting someone's house. You ran into people you knew. You stopped in the canned goods section with a neighbor from 2 blocks away and talked about her mother's health and the school board election and whether the new family on Maple had introduced themselves yet. The conversation happened between the soup and the beans, with one hand on your cart, the other occasionally reaching for something on the shelf while the words continued, and when you finally moved on it was with a lightness that came from having been briefly less alone. This was not something the store had designed for. The store's designed for purchasing, not for community. But community inserted itself anyway, because the women who shopped in the same store had often moved to the same suburb around the same time, were roughly the same age, had children in the same schools, and found in the cereal aisle a neutral ground for the kind of low-key sociability that the suburb, for all its promises of community, did not always easily provide. The suburb was, in one of its recurring ironies, somewhat isolating. The houses were spread out, the sidewalks did not always connect, the car meant that the distances between people were navigable but required intention. You did not just happen to run into your neighbor the way you might have in a city neighborhood where proximity was constant. You ran into her at the grocery store, once a week, in the cereal aisle, and this encounter carried more weight than its content might suggest. Dichter was interested in this too, though he approached it as a commercial matter rather than a sociological one. He found that women who shopped in stores where they felt a sense of community spent more than women who felt anonymous. Not because they were buying social comfort, they weren't buying it, they were finding it, but because a shopper in a good mood was a shopper who had more interior room for desire, who was less vigilant, whose grip on the list was a little looser. Happy shoppers spent more. Lonely shoppers spent carefully. Some stores tried to cultivate this sociability through small gestures, a coffee sample near the entrance on cold mornings, a recipe card offered with certain products, a notice board where local events were posted. These were minor interventions, but they contributed to a sense of the store as a place, rather than just a space. A place had a character. A place had regulars. A place felt like somewhere rather than anywhere. There was also a community of knowledge that circulated in the aisles. Women told each other things. Which brand of washing powder was better than its advertising suggested? Which cut of meat was worth its price this week and which was not? Where the good tomatoes were, as opposed to the ones near the front that looked good but had not yet finished ripening. This was information that the store did not provide, that the packaging could not supply, that came only from the accumulated experience of women who had been shopping in this store for years and had opinions about everything it contained. This horizontal knowledge, woman to woman, was a form of consumer intelligence that the industry found difficult to account for. Word of mouth about a product could make or break it in a neighborhood. A bad experience reported across the cereal aisle, repeated to 6 women, could suppress sales of a product in a specific store for weeks. A good report, circulating with equal speed, could exhaust a store's stock of something before the next delivery arrived. The social network of the supermarket was a market force that no amount of shelf placement or packaging design could fully control. The store's store loyalty was partly built on this social dimension. A woman who had her social life in a particular store, who knew which cashier was kind to her children, who ran into her friends in a particular aisle, who had navigated the floor plan for long enough that it felt like her own, was not going to switch stores over a minor price difference. The social investment was real, and it made her a more loyal customer than any coupon book could. In the evening, after dinner, she might mention the woman she'd run into at the store, relay a piece of information she'd gathered in the bread aisle, pass along the news about the new baby or the husband's new job or the family moving away. The grocery store was part of the information infrastructure of the neighborhood, its aisles functioning as corridors through which the community's news moved from person to person, unhurried, intimate, reliable. The store did not set out to be this. It set out to sell bread and butter and canned goods. But it became a place, in the fullest sense, because people made it one. Because the women who shopped there every week brought to it not just their lists and their coupons but their desire for company, their need for a world outside the house, their interest in each other. The aisle was just a room. But rooms become homes when enough people have lingered in them long enough to care. She comes home and puts everything away, and this is not a small act. It has a sequence to it, a logic she has worked out over years, the frozen things first, straight into the freezer before they soften, then the refrigerator items arranged in the order she learned from her mother and has modified in the years since to fit her own kitchen, her own refrigerator, her own family's preferences. The milk goes on the left side, where the cold is most reliable. The butter goes in the compartment in the door. The vegetables go in the drawer, unwashed, because moisture is the enemy of the crisp lettuce, and she has learned this through a specific incident she does not think about directly but knows in her hands. The dry goods go into the cabinet above the counter, canned goods on the upper shelf where they are visible, cereals and crackers and boxed things on the lower shelf where she can reach them easily. She does not alphabetize, she organizes by use. The things she reaches for every morning are at the front. The things she reaches for once a month are at the back. The system makes sense to no one else and she has never tried to explain it. The bread goes in the bread box. This is one of the few things that is exactly where it has always been, where it will always be, where the bread has been in this kitchen since the first week she moved in and put it there without thinking about it. The bread box is white enamel with a small chrome latch. It came from her mother's kitchen, not the same box but the same idea, the same small act of enclosure that keeps the bread from going stale too quickly and keeps the kitchen from looking cluttered. When everything is away she stands at the counter for a moment, looking at the kitchen as it is now, with the things of the week contained in their places, the kitchen full in a way it was not this morning. This moment is a small satisfaction, one she would not try to describe to anyone, one she recognizes as a private thing, the feeling of a task completed, of a space properly supplied, of having done something practical that was also in some way generous. The groceries represent next week's meals, in the way a set of ingredients represents all the food that can be made from them. She has not yet decided everything she will cook, but the materials are there, available, waiting for her decisions, and having them there makes her feel capable in a way that the empty refrigerator, with its few odds and ends and its jar of pickles, does not. Capability is what the kitchen gives her, the capability to feed people well, to adapt to what the week brings, to have on hand something for almost any occasion. She bought more than was on the list. She knows this without counting. The jar of jam, the box of crackers she'd seen on sale, the new brand of soup that the woman in the next aisle had said was better than the usual kind. These additions are not regrets, exactly. They are the residue of being in a place where things presented themselves, where desire and opportunity were in the same room at the same time, and the distance between noticing and choosing was very small. The people who designed that room knew this. The psychologists who had studied her, the architects who had planned the floor, the packaging designers who had put the red and yellow where the eye would find them, they knew this about her, and about women like her, with a precision that she would have found astonishing and perhaps slightly cold if it had been explained to her directly. They had studied her the way a naturalist studies a species in its habitat, with objectivity, with respect for the complexity of what was being observed, and with the intention of using the findings to produce a particular outcome. She would not have objected to this, necessarily. She understood that the store was trying to sell things. She understood that everything in a commercial space was placed with intention. What she might not have fully grasped was the depth of the study, the years of research and the tens of thousands of interviews and the specific science of motivation and desire that had gone into the arrangement of every square foot of floor she had walked through that morning. She might have found it interesting. She was intelligent about the world and curious about how things worked. She might have read Ernest Dichter's book, if he had written it for her rather than for his clients. She might have recognized herself in his descriptions of the woman in the store, the woman making small choices that meant large things, the woman for whom shopping was never purely transactional because transaction was never purely transactional, because everything humans do carries its weight of feeling and meaning and self-story that makes it more than the surface shows. She might also have found it reassuring, in a complicated way, to know that her desires were comprehensible, that the gap between her list and her cart had a logic, that she was not simply weak or careless but responsive, in ways that were genuine and human and shared by nearly every woman who walked through those automatic doors. This might have been some comfort. Not because the study diminished her, but because it confirmed that she was real, that her responses were real, that the complexity of a Tuesday morning grocery trip was exactly as complex as it had always felt. The kitchen is orderly now. The bread is in the bread box. The milk is on the left side of the refrigerator. The jam, the new jar, the one she had not planned to buy, is on the pantry shelf where it will wait patiently until the old jar is finished. It is a good jar. She had been right about that. Outside, the late morning has settled into the quiet of a weekday. The cars in the driveways belong to women who are home, who are doing the things that are done at home in the middle of a working day, laundry, telephoning, the small repairs and arrangements that keep a household in order. The supermarket parking lot is still busy. It will be busy until mid-afternoon, when the shopping thins out and the store prepares for the after-work rush. The store hums on without her. The music plays to empty aisles and occupied ones. The bread, at the back of the store, waits in its wax paper sleeves for the next woman who came in for one thing and will leave with several. It is always like this. The doors open and close. The carts will forward and back. The small decisions accumulate into a week of meals, a month of eating, a life of provisioning that no one entirely chronicles and no one entirely thanks. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. The kitchen is quiet now. The groceries are away. The bread is in the bread box. Outside, it is the middle of a weekday morning in 1954, and the world is going on in its usual way, and none of it requires anything of you right now. Let the aisles soften. Let the fluorescent lights go dim. Let the music that was playing, the warm, formless music with its slow tempo, its strings that went nowhere and arrived nowhere, let it fade the way all background sounds fade when the attention finally releases them. The cart is empty. You do not need to push it anymore. Somewhere, the bread is cooling. Somewhere, the milk is cold. Somewhere, a jar of jam sits on a shelf waiting for the moment when it is needed, patient the way all provisions are patient, asking nothing, only available. The week stretches ahead, and the kitchen is full, and the work for today is done. The store hums on behind you. The automatic doors open for someone else. The music plays. The bread stays where it has always been, at the back, in the warmth, smelling faintly of something domestic and good. Let all of it grow quiet now. The cart. The list. The arithmetic of what was planned and what was bought and how much the difference came to. It doesn't matter tonight. It worked out. It always works out. The kitchen is in order. The refrigerator hums softly on its own. The bread is in the bread box, in the dark, waiting for morning. You are home. The week is provisioned. Sleep can come now. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.